Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good morning, everyone, and I appreciate that great intro, Urza. I would first like to thank PECB for inviting me to speak today. And, I'm speaking about one of, a very important topic, one of the key changes from ISO 9001-2015 is how organizations manage change. Management of change is a very big challenge for many organizations because change happens so quick in companies. And so, I have been going around and talking to many organizations and trying to help them manage change better within their organization. As Urza mentioned, I have, over 20 years of experience. I've worked with a lot of different organizations implementing quality systems, organizations such as Transocean, Hewlett-Packard, Kawasaki, Cameron, Halliburton. I'm certified through Exemplar as well. And so my point is that I know a little bit about managing change, and hopefully today I'll be able to share some of that with you on today. So let's talk about change. What is change? And so it's important to start off maybe with the definition of change. So the definition of change is the act or instance of making or becoming different. So anytime in your organization someone is taking an action to make something different, that's change. This could be something as small as, changing a purchase order requirements that you're sending to a supplier. It could be something like someone taking the action of changing a sales order. Maybe the customer has made a change. It could be a change where people in the organization are changing. People are being promoted. People are leaving the organization. And so anytime someone leaves the organization, something is being made different. There are possibly things that can fall through the cracks in your organization if the change is not managed properly. And so that's kind of what we're talking about today. Yes, this is a picture of all of you, including myself, when we came out. Right? Nope. Nobody came out smiling, right? No one liked the change. Everybody was comfortable in their mother's womb. Everybody was comfortable. It was nice and cozy. And then we were introduced to change. And sometimes people act just like this now as adults when change happens in their organizations. They start throwing little temper tantrums and start crying and getting upset. So everyone is a bit resistant to change. And so no one likes change. And it started when we were introduced to the world. All right. But today I want to give you 7 steps that can help you manage change within your organizations. The first step is organizations need to recognize that they have a need for change. Many times companies are operating and they are just doing the status quo. And they don't recognize the need for change because they are just so used to operating how they operate on a day-to-day basis. And then the next step is you need to recognize change before it happens. Sometimes people are changing things and the organization has not even realized that the change has occurred. And so we need to recognize when people in the organization make changes. Then 3, we need to force people to justify the need for change. We don't want to just make change for change's sake if it's not necessary. Sometimes change causes more problems. Change may cause duplication in efforts. Maybe someone simply doesn't know that a certain process does exist, or a certain form does exist, or a certain procedure does exist. So people need to be made to justify their rationale for change. Then number 4, once change is made, it requires resources. There's nothing worse than implementing change and not providing the resources, the structure, the processes, the time, the budget, the people, the equipment. There's nothing worse than implementing change and not providing the resources for the change. I'm sure you guys have possibly have experienced this in your organizations, where change was made and people didn't think about everything that was needed. Then number 5, every time that we change something, we should consider the risks and the impacts, because change equals risk. Anytime that we change something, it's definitely a risk, and we need to consider the risk before the change, not after the change is made, but before the change is made, so that we can manage the change. And then changes, number 6, changes should be approved. There's many people in organizations, they make changes and they don't go through the approval process to get the change approved. And again, that introduces risk into the organization. And then lastly, once change is made, it must be communicated and implemented. So it does no good actually to go through all of these steps, 1 through 6, and we forget the most important part of implementing the change and communicating to people that the change has occurred. All right. So hopefully, once we finish today, we'll kind of cover these 7 steps, and hopefully, this is something that you can take back to your organizations and it'll help you. Now, all of you have possibly seen this picture in the news back in April, where United Airlines, they had a situation that caused them to make a major change in their process. But the first thing, before I get into that, United Airlines should have recognized the need for the change before it happened, before this incident on April the 9th. So this need for change for United existed way before April the 9th. So the question is, why didn't they recognize the need for the change before a negative impact? Because that's what it's all about, trying to recognize the need for the change before the organization has a positive or even a negative impact. Because if we are, the definition of continual improvement, that's all about just as an act of business every day, working towards incremental improvement, meaning that we're not stimulated by a negative event. So in some organizations, change happens only when we have a customer complaint. Everyone changes things, and then everybody kind of goes back to their old behaviors. And the company doesn't, work to improve until another negative event. And then we implement a new process and a new procedure. And then everybody kind of goes back into their old ways until the next negative event. So our goal should be to be very proactive and looking out, literally seeking out opportunities for improvement within our organizations before a negative event. And so therefore we're having continual improvement. That's how continual improvement looks. So United Airlines, you know, they have this practice, and you guys have probably all experienced this, such as I have, where airlines overbook flights. This has been an issue for many years, a common practice. But on April the 9th, this issue for United came to a head. So United overbooked this flight, and they needed the seat for the crew members to fly them to their next flight so that they could fly that aircraft and get those other passengers to their destinations. So they overbooked the flight, and they offered an $800 voucher. And no one accepted the $800 voucher. Now, $800 is a pretty good deal, in my opinion. You know, for $800, you could stay at a pretty nice hotel. You could get you the top of the line Uber. You know, you could eat steaks and shrimp overnight and then just catch the next flight. But, you know, sometimes where you're trying to go is more important than this $800 voucher. It doesn't replace you being on time for your destination. So no one accepted this voucher. So United has assumed, and you know, that there's a probability that at least 4 passengers or so are going to accept this $800 voucher. No one accepted. So I guess their contingency plan is that they will randomly select passengers that are on board, and they will remove those passengers. Now just imagine that. You have booked your flight, you have somewhere to go, and you put your carry-on luggage overhead, you closed the bin, you sat down in your seat, buckled up, had your headphones on, looking at, you know, listening to your music, going through your iPhone, and someone comes up and says, hey, Mr. Combs, we're going to have to remove you from the flight. You know, I would be first shocked. Like, how can you remove me from the flight? I'm already on the flight. I boarded. I'm seated. I'm buckled up. I'm ready to go. I paid my ticket. I booked my ticket, paid it. You guys checked me in. Now you're saying you need to, I mean, so you can imagine the shock of these passengers. And so this one passenger was like, no, I'm not moving. I'm already booked in. I'm seated. And United proceeded to forcefully remove this passenger. This is this passenger in this picture. You guys probably saw all of these pictures on the news. So they proceed to pull this passenger out. I mean, he's all bloodied up. His nose is bleeding. And I mean, it was a big struggle. And there was a major public outcry because everyone, of course, has their video cameras on their phones, taking video, posting those videos to social media. And it was all over the place. It turned into a major crisis for United Airlines. All right. Now, did United recognize that the process of overbooking flights could potentially lead to this? Yes, they did. But evidently they didn't recognize the need to change it until something negative happened. So on April the 11th, 2 days later, United's stock value decreased by $255 million. Now that was a very expensive ticket for United. $255 million lost in 2 days. Now, on April the 14th, 5 days later, United changes the policy of not removing passengers that have already boarded planes. Now, it's amazing how all of a sudden, after the negative impact of losing $255 million, they then were able to recognize the need for the change, and they did it, guess what, very quickly. You know, that's another argument that people make when it comes to change, is that, you know, big organizations, it takes a long time to implement changes. I believe United showed that in 5 days they made a pretty significant change to their process, but it was only because they experienced a negative effect. So we want to recognize the need for changes in our organizations before the negative effect. You know, you guys know in your companies where things are happening and you understand the need and where the problems are. You see these potential problems that you could, if you take action on them, or if management takes action on them, we can prevent these problems. But often when problems happen, people say, man, I knew that was going to happen. Well, that's what the 2015 standard is all about. 9001-2015 is about assessing our risk and looking at the opportunities that we can address to prevent or reduce undesired effects. Do you believe that United pulling this passenger off the flight, major negative impact to their image, major financial impact to their organization? That's an undesired effect. You know, that's bringing this definition to life when you look at it in a real life situation. So what we should do in our organizations is look at the risk in our processes. It says, the standard says risk and opportunities. So we need to look at the risk and also look at the opportunities, because sometimes when you assess risk, it will provide an opportunity for an improvement in your organizational processes. And then we should be doing these things proactively, because it says that we need to do this to prevent, which means that we're not being reactive, we are being proactive and trying to prevent undesired effects. All right. So the risk of, you know, United having this issue existed for a long time, but United ignored the risk and they also ignored the opportunity, the risk and the opportunity to do something about it before the undesired effect on April the 9th that caused them to lose $255 million. And of course, the gentleman that they pulled off, they also had to settle with that passenger. And they settled with this passenger for an undisclosed amount, meaning that this passenger can't talk about it, United can't talk about it, but I guarantee you it was more than $800 voucher that they offered this passenger. It was a very expensive ticket. So let's just assume that United recognized the need for this change before April the 9th. So just imagine maybe the United quality personnel or process improvement, quality improvement group or customer service groups, maybe they're sitting around in a conference room and, you know, drawing the process on a dry erase board or something. And they are trying to assess the process that they know about of overbooking the flights. And so as they are collaborating and working together, they are looking at the risk in this process. Now, this is all happening hopefully way before April the 9th. And someone says, hey, you know what? There's a risk that we will not have enough seats for passengers and the crew if the flight is overbooked. And then they go on and say, hey, you know, what's the probability of that happening? And as a group, they think about it and they say, you know, that's probably a high probability because, you know, it's a standard process here for the airline industry. We do it quite often, and United already knows that they send out a lot of vouchers already, so they know it's a high probability that this could occur. And they continue to think about it, and they say, if this did occur, what would be the impact of it? Well, let me see. So there could be a potential impact of, you know, us having a conflict on board. You know, just imagine if a passenger is on the flight and they're already seated, they're probably going to be upset. So, and we would have to remove them because our policy states that we would remove them. So there's possible impact here. And also it's possible impact that, you know, the public, there's other passengers that would be seated and we would be removing these other passengers. And it's a possibility for us to have an altercation on the flight. There's a possibility that this could be a social media crisis for us. People may be posting these videos. I mean, we're just going back in the past and just assuming that they would have recognized this need or this risk before it actually happened, right? And if that happened, we would have a potential loss in our stock value. It could be poor image to our company. And then, you know, guys, we need to determine if we need to make this change. Do we need to change this process before all of these things happen? Because our experience tells us that this could occur. You know, we understand, you know, from looking at this from a proactive standpoint that this could occur. We have the foresight to see that it could occur. So should we change it? Yeah, we should change this process possibly. So what could we possibly do to prevent this potential undesired effect? Well, maybe we could discontinue the practice of overbooking flights. This is what this clause of the standard is talking about. Clause 6.1.1.c is how you should look at the risk and the opportunities in your processes in your organization and see if we have a need for change. So let's move on. Talking about recognizing the change before it occurs. You know, management first must establish a culture of compliance, meaning that employees need to understand that you cannot just change things on your own. Change in organizations must be approved, and employees should not feel comfortable circumventing a process or changing a process, deviating from a process without it being approved. And because when people do that in their day-to-day processes, you know, they are just trying to simply, employees for the most part are trying to do a good job, and they're just trying to get from point A to point B and to get it done. But sometimes if the process is not designed properly, or maybe they don't understand it, or maybe someone didn't train them properly, they may hit a roadblock or a constraint, but their job is, their focus is on getting from point A to point B, so they're going to do whatever they need to do to get their job done to get to point B. And so sometimes that may involve them circumventing a process. That's why we say that management must establish a culture of compliance. So when that happens and employees are tempted to deviate or change a process that's already been approved, that's where the culture of compliance should come in, and employees should be held accountable. They should be disciplined. You know, discipline is where people are committed to following the organizational processes that have been established. And we're going to do it this way. The process says we're going to do it this way. We're going to be disciplined and committed, and management must hold people accountable to follow established processes and procedures. Because we can't have people in organizations just making changes all day. We need to have people in organizations that are following the established processes and procedures. Now, if the process and procedures are not working, that's where we can revise them and manage the change. But any unmanaged change is a bad thing. Even if the impact is good, it's bad. So let's just say, for example, we have a buyer using an unapproved vendor. Now, the buyer may have a good reason why he or she may want to use this vendor, and the impact may be good, but because the change is not managed, it's bad. Sales may offer an additional discount to a customer, maybe beyond the discount that has been approved, maybe beyond their normal discount. The impact of getting a new customer may be good, but because it was done outside of the process and the change was not managed, it's bad. The project manager could implement a new step in a process, maybe trying to be more efficient, maybe simply just wanting to do it his or her way. The impact may be good to the project, but it's still deviating from what has been established. So therefore, and it's not managed. So it could be bad for the organization. So when people want to change things or deviate from a process, they should request that. They should assess the impacts of what they're about to do. Hopefully get it approved before they make the change. So the point here is that people in your organization, well, first off, we should establish a culture of compliance, and people should be held accountable to follow established processes. And if those processes need to be revised, that's okay, but it needs to be managed, okay? So moving on to step 3, people should have to justify changes. You know, sometimes people in organizations just want to put their stamp on things, right? They want to say, you know, I made this change, or this is the way I want to do it. May not mean that it's better, or is it more efficient? Is it beneficial to the organization? So, and sometimes people make changes simply because they don't know the existing process. They don't know the procedure. They don't know that that form existed, so they created a new form. And so now we got 2 forms now, right? So this is why people need to be forced to justify their changes. You know, so why can't the buyer use an approved supplier that provides the same product or service? You know, do we have other suppliers? You know, you want to add a new supplier, but do we already have suppliers that have been properly evaluated and that are on the approved vendors list? Why does sales feel the need to offer an additional discount? You know, that could have a negative impact on the organization financially. Why didn't United, you know, that change that they made, was it justified? Yeah, looking back, that change that they made in regards to their policy change of not removing passengers now, was that change justified? Yes, it was justified, but it was a little too late. But we'll talk about that here in a bit. So people should be required to justify the rationale for the change. Sometimes when you force people to do that, they realize that, hey, we really don't need to change. We already have something in place, or what we already have in place, it just simply needs to be revised. It just needs to be updated, possibly. All right. So the point here is forcing someone to justify the change is that it just simply forces people to slow down a bit. Think about what you're about to do before you do it. Think about if it's going to have any ripple effects, any negative impacts on other people. Step 4 is, once we decide that, yeah, we need to change things, we need to define what the required resources are, because that's a big part of managing change. You know, good changes can have negative impacts if you don't have the resources. provided. So United, they made a good change within 5 days. Now tell me organizations, big organizations can't make changes really quick. They made a big change like that in 5 days. Their crew can no longer displace passengers that have boarded planes. So now the policy is if you are seated on that plane, the crew will have to figure something else out. They will no longer remove passengers once you're boarded. That's the change that they made in their policy. All right, but even that change probably is going to have some impacts on United. For one, because it probably wasn't managed well. You can't manage a big change like that in 5 days. There's no way that you could have assessed all of the risk and impacts and undesired effects that could occur because of this change in 5 days. It's not possible. So even though it was a good change, because it's probably unmanaged, it's probably going to have some negative impacts on United and still passengers as well. So what's going to happen when this is the last flight and it comes down to the crew making their flight and a passenger missing their flight? This is going to happen. This scenario is going to happen. Has United thought about how they're going to deal with this situation? Will they now need to have backup crews? Will they need to have additional flights? Will they need to figure out a solution where if the passenger can't make the flight, they can still get the passenger to their destination on time? How much will this change of no longer displacing passengers that have boarded the plane, what's the cost of that? See, the cost before was simply $800, a voucher, and rebooking them on another flight, which is probably a lot less expensive than the cost that they're going to have to incur because of the change that they made within 5 days. Is it going to be less than $255 million that they lost in their market share? See, these are all the things that even when we are in the midst of responding to negative events, if we're not making wise decisions or thinking about the impact of our changes, yeah, the change of no longer displacing passengers, that's a good change. But could it have a negative impact on United? That's the question. Because what we need to realize is that every action has a reaction. It's the theory of cause and effect. If someone in your organization makes a change and they may think that, you know, this change that I'm making is not impacting anyone else. Well, no, because as in an organization, every process is interrelated. Every process is integrated. And so your one small change that one person makes in an organization that hasn't been approved, that we haven't assessed the impacts of that small change, the ripple impacts on other processes downstream that have all been designed to work together, it could have a negative impact if it's not managed properly. So to make sure that we are managing change properly, what we need to ensure we're doing is consider the risk and the impacts. The key word here is before the change is implemented. It's easy to you know, sometimes people say, well, 2020 is hindsight. So what they're saying is that, you know, they couldn't see this scenario happen before it happened. And now it's only 2020 is only clear because we're looking back at the incident. We're looking in hindsight, looking back at it, right? Well, no, you can have, it may not be 2020, but you can maybe have 2030 or get close to 2020 by slowing down and doing a risk assessment. We can predict some of these things and see them happening before they occur, because I mean, we have the experience. You guys live in your organizations. You know the people. You know the processes. You know the problems that you're having today. You know what needs to be changed. So you're able to kind of do a risk assessment and look at things that may need to be changed. So let's look at this. So the sales providing an additional discount, the buyer, that was the change the buyer made. So if the buyer is maybe thinking about this, what's the risk of me doing this? Well, it could be that the project is less profitable, right? If you take more money off the table that the company can earn, that means less profitability. And if you do that over and over again, the company is more or less profitable, which is not a good thing. The impact of that would be reduced profitability for the company. If the company is less profitable, we have layoffs. So looking at that, can we, before the buyer makes that decision to make that change, if we slow down just a little bit and just think about the implications of those changes, it may force us to either not make the change, get the change approved, or put mitigations in place to reduce the negative impact of the change. So maybe this additional discount is approved. So maybe we want to look for additional opportunities to upsell or sell additional services to try to make up for the discount. What about the buyer using unapproved suppliers, right? Making that change. You know, if the buyer slowed down a little bit and the buyer thinks of the risk, well, you know, this supplier may not be able to meet our on-time delivery demands. They may be cheaper, less expensive, but the problem that they bring with them of not being able to deliver on time could have a negative impact on our company. It could cause us to be late on our deliveries to our customers. But, you know, the change that the buyer made was a positive impact. It was cheaper, but it caused a negative impact because the supplier could not meet the on-time deliveries. So what can we do to mitigate the change? So it's possibly okay to use this new supplier, but we need to get the new supplier approved first. Or something better that we can do is let's use our suppliers that have already been approved. And if we want to still use this supplier, let's make sure we evaluate the new supplier properly. Because once we evaluate them before we start using them, we may recognize that they may not be able to meet our on-time delivery demands, and we don't have to wait until they're late and have a negative impact on our operation and then say, well, hindsight was 2020. Well, no, we could foresee that if we manage the change properly and look at the risk of the change. So United no longer displacing their passengers, that's the change that they made, and the risk is that crew members may not be able to make their next flight. That's a pretty significant risk. And so the impact could be that you have passengers on the other end at the other city waiting for their flight, and their flight may be canceled. So as opposed to this 1 or 4 passengers that are inconvenienced, now you could possibly have a whole nother flight of hundreds of passengers that are inconvenienced, and that would also be a negative impact. And so United, are they looking at these things? Do they have they put things in place to mitigate the risk? Have they established backup crews? Do they plan to maybe establish additional flights so they can make more seats available? Do they plan to partner with other airlines? You know, we don't know, but the whole point here is before we make changes, we should look at the risk, the impacts of those changes. And then the changes must be approved. You know, people should not be allowed in your organizations just to change things and not get them approved first. You know, management should hold people accountable, establish that culture of compliance. Yeah, is it quicker to just make a change? It's quicker to just use this new supplier and not go through the entire supply evaluation process that may take a couple of weeks, who knows? But what's going to be the impact? It's probably worth going through that process, the supplier evaluation process properly, not deviating from it. And if we need to change it, we can change the process, but we're not going to deviate from it. And is that going to have a lesser impact than that new supplier being late and causing us to be late for our customers and possibly causing us to lose a customer? So we have to make sure that when changes are made and people want to make changes, that the changes are approved before they start changing it. So what we want to do is to follow a management of change process. You know, that involves defining the issue. So what is the current issue that you're facing? Why do you feel like you need to make this change? Number two, we need to look at, well, do we have a current process? What's the document number of the procedure or the process that we currently have to address this issue that you say you're having? And then looking at that, can we justify the need for that change? We have a process over here that says we should do it this way. Can we justify changing that the way it's already designed? And if the answer is yes, do we have the resources to do that? Do we have the equipment to support this change? Do we have the people to support the change? Do we have the budget, the time? What are the risks involved in this change that we're about to make? Now, the key thing here is that we're thinking about making a change before it happened. This is the whole point of what I'm hoping to get across today is we need to do all of these things that we're talking about before the change is made. Looking at the risk and what controls do we need to control the risk? What impact will this change have on current responsibilities and authorities? You know, maybe this change involves us hiring an additional personnel, or maybe a reduction in head count, or maybe a new position. New authorities may be necessary. And is the change approved? So these are 7 steps that organizations could really use before they make the change to get the change approved. And then once the change is approved and we say, yes, change is necessary, let's move forward, well, then we need to communicate and implement the change. You know, once a change has been approved, it must be communicated, because the change, maybe it's been determined that the change is necessary. It has been approved. We have looked at the risk. And if we don't make this change, maybe it's going to have an undesired effect. Well, sometimes organizations even suffer with actually executing the change. So maybe an organization is trying to address a need by making a change and it has been approved, but until they actually implement that change, that problem that they're trying to prevent still exists. All right. So the way that organizations communicate changes is that we revise policies, procedures. We revise or create, shall I say, policies, procedures. Maybe we're communicating things through news releases, emails, videos, newsletters, notice boards, memos, contracts, supplier communications. You know, these are some common communication channels that organizations use to communicate approved changes, because we have to make sure all of the internal and external parties involved in the change know about it and that they're working to change their behavior and processes as well. Something else that I want to point out is that when we make changes typically need to be communicated 3 times, and often in 3 different methods. You know, I just call this a 3x3. So maybe I'm going to talk to someone about a change or a need for a change verbally. Once it's been approved, I'm going to tell them about it verbally, maybe in a meeting. Second, I may provide a procedure, a revised procedure of the change. And then on the third time, maybe I may do a follow-up email, and again, trying to reinforce that change. But if you are only communicating a change one time, let's say issuing a revised procedure to someone and thinking that they are going to just change automatically, that's not going to happen. We need to always communicate at least 3 times via 3 methods, because of this Kurt Lewin change model. It tells us that people are not like a light switch. They're not like a machine, that they're just not going to change because you have revised and approved a procedure, and now it's been approved and you issue it, and you do not assume that people are just going to change because you've emailed them a new procedure or process. So it's what we call the Kurt Lewin change model. We unfreeze people, meaning we're going to just start talking about the change. Hey guys, we're just changing this supplier. We're adding, we have a need to add a new supplier, so we are starting to evaluate this new supplier. Maybe next month or so, we'll bring this supplier on board. They'll be available for use. Just getting people ready, talking about it. And then we implement the change. Once, this has all been approved now. This is not where we have just changed. We have gone through a management of change process. Now we're getting people ready to receive the change. And so now we bring this new supplier on, right? So we implement the change. Maybe tell people again, hey, the supplier has now been entered into the system, ready for use. They've been properly evaluated. There could be a risk here with them. They don't have a big infrastructure. Their equipment is a little antiquated, but they will still work. But you guys need to be mindful when you're ordering from them. Or maybe you should only use them as a backup or something. So implement the change, and we're talking about it. And then give people opportunity to make the change, right? To refreeze it. Like, this is the way we do things now. Like, this is our new supplier now. This is the new way we do things now. So here we're refreezing. We are training people. We are continuing to have meetings and discussing the change. And now it becomes the new way. And even when people slip back into their old ways, we're going to redirect them to the new process, to the new procedure. We're going to redirect them, hold them accountable. And then this is how we can refreeze. And refreezing means that the change, the approved change, now has become the norm or the new way of doing things in the organization. Well, I definitely hope I was able to add some value and shed some light to you today in regards to how organizations can manage change. We understand that it's very important. And, I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to speak with you on today. And I really hope you all have a great rest of your day and the rest of your week. And I'm going to turn it back over to Urza. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Combs, for this very informative and pleasant presentation. I would also like to inform you all that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 9001 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, Lead Auditor, and ISO 9001-2015 Transition. A PCB certificate will demonstrate your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. For more information, please visit our website pcb.com. Now, without further ado, I will read some of the questions from attendees regarding today's presentation. So one of the attendees asked that, are risks and opportunities required to be documented And if so, where would an organization identify this information? If the organization decides to keep a quality manual, would it be appropriate to include a SWOT analysis in the manual?
Yes. So what many organizations are doing is generating what we call a risk register. So they're registering all of their risks in this register. And some organizations are definitely doing a SWOT analysis. Now, normally these tools reside outside of your quality system, but your quality system would refer to them. So I would not recommend putting it in your quality manual, but maybe make it a form that you make reference to that form in your quality manual.
All right, thank you for your answer, Mr. Combs. I will continue with the other question. One asks, what are the major impacts that an organizations need to consider for ISO 9001-2015?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good question. The major impacts that you can expect is one in regards to leadership. 9001-2015 requires top management to take more of a leadership role beyond, and leadership is different than being committed. Leadership is being engaged and involved in the quality system, leading it, guiding it. Another area is this area of risk-based thinking, which is kind of what we talked about today. Thinking about risk in our processes proactively before they have a negative impact on your organization, and it may prompt the need for changes. Other things like interested parties, context of the organization. Do we really understand the operating environment of our organization, the internal factors, the external factors, regulatory requirements, customers' requirements, surrounding community, customers, suppliers, all these things. Do we really understand their needs and expectations? How we manage change. ISO 9001-2015 requires organizations now to manage change. That was not in 2008 standard. These are some of the key elements that will impact organizations. And I'll just say this, organizations that are transitioning, you guys probably already know this, you have up to September of 2018 to make that transition, or your ISO cert will not be valid. And so I would encourage you to probably go ahead and start that process this year, and no later than starting it in May of next year.
All right, Mr. Combs, I will just continue with some of the other questions. Okay, another attendee asked that how is change management reflected in the 2015 version of the standard?
Yes. Well, we kind of covered that in this presentation, but it's reflected in that there's a whole section on managing the changes in the organization, and primarily where when requirements change, maybe customer requirements or production requirements or service requirements may change. It's going to be important that a focus be placed on updating any impacted documents, updating any impacted people involved in the changes, and again, providing those resources to execute the change. Management of change is a pretty significant introduction to ISO 9001, and it's something that we kind of talked about it today, but I would encourage you to kind of read up on it a bit more and ensure that you implement a formal management of change process within your organizations.
All right. Another question from the attendee is that in situations where members of the top management are not committed to change, how do you successfully implement the change?
Well, one way is doing the need assessment, the risk assessment, right? Because if you follow that table that I was showing you on how we identify the need for the change, the risk involved, and you can do that for the existing process to communicate or identify why it's necessary to change. So for example, in the United example that we talked about, if maybe management wasn't committed to making the change, but someone did the whole risk assessment and presented the potential impact of $255 million loss in market share. That what management, they speak numbers, right? So we have to, if you're trying to convince them that a change is necessary and maybe they're not committed to making that change, you have to talk their language, and for the most part, upper management is going to be talking financials. And so the more you're able to correlate the need for the change with a potential financial impact on the organization, you will get your management's buy-in, and more importantly, you'll get their attention as well.
Thank you, Mr. Combs, for all your answers. Due to the time limit, I will only read one last question, and the rest of the questions Mr. Combs will answer to you directly on your emails. So the last question that we have is, can we introduce the risk and opportunities in all processes?
Yes, you definitely can. So I would encourage you to take your process interaction map. And actually on our YouTube channel, there's a video called process-oriented, process-focused, risk-based thinking. And you can go to our YouTube channel. It'll walk you through a process on how to take your process interaction map from start to finish and assess all of the processes on your process interaction map proactively, and ask yourself, what risks do we have in these processes at each step? So for example, a quick example, let's say that a potential customer or your customer has submitted a request for a quote. So if we ask ourselves, what kind of risk do we have in that one process? There could be a risk of the customer not providing all of the information that we need to prepare a quote. Or the customer may not understand what all the requirements are, so there's a risk that they don't understand and we don't ask them the right questions, right? So yes, take your process interaction map, ask yourself for each process on your process interaction map, what kind of risk do we have in the process? Also check out, like I said, on our YouTube channel, the ISO 9001 group on YouTube, and you can find a video where we spend about 30 minutes talking about this. Hope that helps.
All right, I will make just one last exception, since we can go like 2-3 minutes over time and attendee is really eager to learn the answer. One last question and then we can finish. So the attendee asked, what about crazy time management, which is always part of any change, even if it's risks and impact assessment done?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yes. Okay, so he said, what about crazy time management, which is always part of any change, even if its risks and impacts are done?
Crazy time management?
Yes.
You said time management?
Yes,
Crazy time.
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay, I'm not sure what the question is. When you say crazy time management, maybe you're talking about how you manage time when you manage the change, right? Because time is a very precious resource. And so any change, it may take a long time, or some of the changes may not take a lot of time. So maybe the question is, do we have time to manage this change properly? And the answer is yes, you have to still be disciplined to manage, to take the time to manage the change and evaluate the risk. Because as I indicated, sometimes it's quicker to just to make the change, or we feel like it is, but the negative impacts that the unapproved change has on the organization actually causes more time delays. But even once the change is approved, time is still of the essence, and it has to be done in an expedient manner. You know, we change just can't be happening over months and years, and you know, it needs to happen as quick as possible. That's from what I understand that from that question, crazy time management. Hopefully, I provided the answer. I'm not sure.
All right, thank you. I would like to thank you once again for this presentation, Mr. Combs. It was truly an honor having you as a presenter.
Thank you as well. I appreciate it.
I would also like to thank all the attendees for taking their time out of their busy schedule to join us. Please be reminded that this webinar was recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel as well as the PowerPoint slides. We hope you enjoy our webinar and we wish you a wonderful day. Goodbye.